Please be seated. Good morning. Good morning. It is a joy to be with all of you for the past several weeks, and I wish I could say the same about today's gospel reading, because this is a really, really hard and difficult gospel reading to process. We've just come off this wonderful week with St. Francis Day and the Oktoberfest, and this week we're having a prayer lab, and then we run into full tilt into today's gospel reading. So, when I'm trying to make sense of it, I read it several times, and I did what all good seminarians do. In case of emergency, we hit the books. This is the latest in a long series of parables, or several parables, that Jesus delivers after he reaches Jerusalem. We heard several of these over the last few weeks, except last week we didn't because of St. Francis' Day. And this parable has two parts in it. The first part is all about this king and his invited guests to this banquet that he's throwing for his son's wedding. Seems simple enough, except the guests act in a really odd and uncharacteristic way. They ignore and reject his invitation. They mistreat and kill his slaves. And then, in retaliation, the king burns their city. This parable, like the others we've been hearing, contains a thinly veiled, or maybe not so thinly veiled, criticism of the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jesus' day. They have refused to accept Jesus' message. And this gospel was also written about 70 years in the common area, about 30 years after Jesus' earthly ministry ended. And it also may point to the tensions that were going on in the Jewish Christian community that was this gospel's audience. Because the community at the time was divided about whether or not this would remain an offshoot of Judaism, a Jewish faith, or if they would be forced or asked to leave and become its own thing. And we know how this ended. And it also took place against the backdrop of a very powerful Roman Empire. And this was a fringe sect in a marginalized religion, and they were struggling to survive. So perhaps some of the imagery and the violence makes sense there. But it also resonates to today. It's impossible, for me at least, to hear this story and not think of what is going on in the Holy Land right now, the violence and the suffering of innocent people on both sides, based on centuries-old conflicts and based on the decisions of their leaders. We still have so far to go on the path towards peace. So that's the first part of the story, but the second part is just as difficult, if not more so. The offending guests have been chastised. New guests have been invited. The king makes the rounds at the banquet, happy to see everybody enjoying themselves, when suddenly he sees something is not right. One guest doesn't belong. All of the other guests have wedding garments. He doesn't. And when the king asks him about it, he has nothing to say. So what does the king do? He too acts in an odd and uncharacteristic, not to mention a frightening and violent way. He has this guest bound and thrown out into the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. As part of our gospel study in school, we are often encouraged to try to imagine ourselves into this story. Maybe that's why it makes me so uncomfortable, because this behavior is so strange at best and terrifying at worst. I mean, I know I've only been here with you for a few weeks, but I simply cannot imagine Father David, Deacons Pat or Alan, or Tina or Bill, or anyone in this community ever asking in that tone, "How did you get in here?" Let alone throwing them into the outer darkness or setting fires. It's just beyond my power to imagine. And actually, I have to say that is a very good thing, because I have just completed my Safe Church Renewal training, and I'm pretty sure that none of these meets the standards for acceptable behavior. But often, the kings in these stories, they represent God. And what really makes me so uncomfortable, does that mean our hospitality as a church, as a human, limited community, is better than God's? That's really disturbing. Fortunately, my books provided me with a cultural context that was at least somewhat helpful, and that would have been clear to the people who heard this parable for the first time. This particular interpretation suggests that the wedding garment represents a gift from God, and it's an invitation for each person to relationship, and it's a symbol of welcome and inclusion. According to this interpretation, if the guest wasn't wearing a wedding garment, it was because he had removed it and was therefore rejecting God's invitation. And that also explains why these two stories are paired together. The initial guests rejected the king's invitation. This guest, without his wedding garment, took it off, also rejecting the king's invitation. And these scholars suggest that the outer darkness in this story is not a place, not a prison, not the fires of hell or the cold outer circle of hell that Dante describes, which came up in my mind, at least, when I hear this story. But it represents alienation from God and from community. That explanation is somewhat comforting. It doesn't explain everything. For example, it doesn't explain the last line of the parable, many are called and few are chosen. Obviously, more research on my part is called for. And it also doesn't explain why some people might not know they were invited. Some people might not know they have a wedding garment. But it does provide a much clearer interpretation than my initial confused thoughts, was that somebody was thrown out of a wedding for not wearing a nice enough outfit. And that didn't sound like Jesus to me at all. And as I thought about it some more, I wonder if in our culture, like the outer darkness, if the whole meaning of the parable hasn't shifted somewhat or drifted away from its original meaning. As a church and as a society, we haven't always done a great job of remembering that the invitation to a life in community is God's to offer. And instead, we humans, both inside and outside the church, have taken it upon ourselves to judge, and sometimes, just like the king, just with a glance, to decide who belongs and who doesn't, who's included and who is not. And sometimes this is for really shallow and superficial reasons. Maybe someone isn't dressed well enough, or they live in the wrong neighborhood. Or, as Father David says each week, maybe they live in a tent. Or their ethnicity and their cultural background doesn't quite fit in with everyone else in the room. Or they love someone of the same gender. Or they're differently abled. Or whatever. It goes on and on. And sadly, this is still going on, even today. Here are a few examples that I found from the last few months. A young woman reached out for support on social media. She is a mother of two young children, and was leaving an abusive marriage. Her church rebuked and shunned her. A friend of mine, a woman of color, shared with me that she almost left her church because even though she signed up and paid to attend a special event, the organizers thought that she was part of the catering staff. On another social media platform, a man shared his pain. He came out in midlife, and his family, including his then former spouse, and his grown children were extremely happy for him and extremely supportive of him, but he felt unwelcome and unwanted in his church, who didn't want to hear his story and didn't want to accept his new identity. Our history is also full of these examples, and some of you may have stories of your own to share. We struggle as a church, as a faith, with welcome and inclusion, and as a Christianity as a whole, we have sometimes forgotten that the invitation is from God and not from us. So if any of you, and any of you watching, have ever made to feel as if you don't have a wedding garment, or that yours is the wrong size or the wrong shape, if you feel that you are not good enough or holy enough or godly enough to be in this sacred place, I'm going to say this even though I've only been here a few weeks, please know that you are welcome here. Our life in community is not being good or holy or godly enough, whatever that even means. It is about sharing a sacred journey together, one in which we strive to welcome one another as we have been welcomed and to love as we have been loved. That is your birthright. Perhaps it is even your God-giving wedding garment. In my short time here, I have seen how foundational welcome is to our common life. Here are a few examples. The delicious community dinners prepared with such care on Tuesday nights that I attended for the first time this past week. The prayer labs and Sunday seminars designed to offer new and innovative ways for us to gather and learn. The hospitality of the Sunday welcome table just outside the door, which offers instructions, introductions, and really delicious cookies. And we offer this welcome. We strive to be this welcoming community, this community of inclusivity and love, at a time when it is not easy to be a church. No, we're not a fringe sect of a minority religion, as was the case when Matthew's gospel was first written. But we have our own challenges. Every week, it seems, we see yet another news article about how the church is dying, our numbers are dwindling, and that even the term Christian itself may be becoming toxic. But we don't let that stop us. As we continue to practice this sacred art of welcome, if we do grow tired or discouraged or doubtful, perhaps the words from today's epistle, which Lucy just read for us so well, may be helpful. I hope St. Paul will forgive me a few small grammar changes. We can do all things through Christ that strengthens us.